Hi, folks. Florida Man here. I am with David Hood, social media, diplomacy superstar, tournament director,
Oh boy.
and two-time North American champion. And he's here to give us some insights on how to do well at tournament-level diplomacy.
Douglas, how you doing?
Not bad, thanks. How are you?
I'm great. Great. Glad to be here.
Well, I'm very glad to have you. And thank you for agreeing to join us.
Absolutely. I've been watching your video series, really enjoyed it.
Thank you. That's very flattering. So why don't you tell the audience a little bit about how you got into diplomacy and started playing tournaments, and then I'll get to some more specific questions.
Well, for me, it started at the very tail end of high school. So we had a group of 6, 7, 8 guys that played a lot of Risk and maybe some other games. But we were really looking for a game that didn't have any luck in it or as much luck in it, and that's how we found diplomacy, and was sort of never looked back after we found it. So we started, actually, our very first game that we played, I remember even it was played at Doug Hargett's house, a guy that I knew. And from the very first game we played, we scored all of our games with our own scoring system. So it was a very early club or league play is how we got started. And so that for the next couple of years, that's what we did. Played a lot, both in Charlotte area, which is where I grew up, and then at Chapel Hill, which is where I went to college. And then had the bright idea to start going to tournaments. So I went to my first one in 1986, of all things.
Wow. Your first one in 1986.
It's true.
Now that I think of it, that's not very far from when you won your first North American championship, is it?
It was the next year, surprisingly. So I had been to a couple of tournaments before I went to the 1987 DipCon in Madison, Wisconsin, and that was the one that I won.
Wow.
Much of a surprise to myself as it was to everyone else, because people barely knew who I was in those days. I had just started my own tournament that May. That was DixieCon had just started as my first tournament that in May, and then I think a couple of months later is when I went to Madison and won the thing. It was surreal.
Very cool. You must have been quite the talent. I mean, the natural talent to have just like not an overnight success per se, but like to go from playing with your friends in your youth to doing a couple tournaments, and then you're the North American champion.
Well, yeah, I mean, I agree. It was a little surreal, but I will say it was partially because I had played so many games. You know, when we were playing in our club for that couple of years before then, or 3 years before then, we played a lot of diplomacy. A couple of hundred games that we recorded. There were probably a few that we didn't finish, and so we didn't record. But that was in those days. That was a lot of diplomacy because, of course, this is pre-internet, so there was no chance to play online. And I did play some by mail, but those games took a long time. So I actually probably had as much or more experience, even as a young tournament goer, than most of the people I was playing with. And one way to look at this is the first tournament we went to, one of my other guys, Morgan Gurley, came in 5th in the first tournament we ever went to. And then I won the DipCon in 1987. My buddy Dan, also from our club, won DipCon in 1988. I mean, it was partially because we had so much experience playing, I think.
Well, I think that makes a lot of sense. They say that practice makes perfect, and conversely, there's this semi-scientific idea that you need something like 10,000 hours of practice to become an expert at any skill. So it sounds pretty clear that you had that.
Well, I may not have had 10,000 hours, but I was working on it probably. But by the time, I mean, it's a little dangerous to say that, because if you play diplomacy with the same crowd, and we're going to talk about this in a few minutes, if you play diplomacy all the time with the same people, it can get a little stale, and you actually can have a little bit too much groupthink about how to do things on the board. So it's way better for your diplomacy development to play with as many different types of people as you can.
That makes a lot of sense to me. Something to keep in mind. You don't want to get stuck with just the same crew all the time. Now, you mentioned how, obviously this was before the days of online diplomacy. I don't know if you've done a lot of online diplomacy yourself, or if you might want to discuss at all the differences between face-to-face play and virtual face-to-face play and online play as you've experienced them.
Yeah, I think that's actually a critical point to what we're going to talk about tonight, which is essentially how to do well at face-to-face or virtual face-to-face tournaments, because that is a very, very different animal than playing online, which I have done. And I go back even further. I played by email before they had a true internet. I played by email, and I played by, as I said, paper mail, regular mail, U.S. mail, snail mail. Played a whole bunch of those games, and they're all different. They're all different forms of communication. The guest game is, of course, about communication in a lot of ways. And so you may excel in a particular form of communication, and then you get to a different one, and you're like, what the crap? I don't know what I'm supposed to do here. And it happens a lot with players who have primarily played online and then go to a face-to-face event, and vice versa, to be honest with you. People that just play face-to-face and then go online are not used to the level of analysis that you can do in an online game because you've got time to do it. Face-to-face games all about doing things like that, and that's a different environment. But then we've got this new thing that we started this year called virtual face-to-face, which is in itself a different animal. You know, it's a little bit of an amalgamation of the two in the sense that you're not there speaking, you know, in person with folk like we do in a face-to-face game. So you can't read the body language. You can't do a few of the things we're going to talk about later when we get to my tips. But it's also very similar to face-to-face in the sense that you're talking live over Discord or some other program. You're talking live with people while you play, and it's really fascinating to see how this completely new way of diplomacy has been developed just over the past 8 months. I mean, it really started. There was a very small event in England in April, and then it was my tournament in May is when we really started the virtual face-to-face circuit this year. It's one of the very, very few things that's good that's come out of this pandemic is this creation of this new way to play, which I think will continue to be a thing going forward, even after we're back to doing face-to-face tournaments. I think virtual face-to-face is here to stay.
I hope so. I had fun in the virtual Liberty Cup tournament I participated in, and it's also much easier for a lot of people to do the virtual face-to-face rather than travel to a lot of dispersed tournament locations.
Absolutely.
Which is not to say we don't want to keep doing face-to-face, because that is a lot of fun in different ways.
It's tremendous. It's quite an exhilaration to go to a face-to-face event. That's, again, part of why we're doing this video, I think, is to encourage people that not only is it fun, you can get better at it. And you can get better at it by doing a few things ahead of time. So we're certainly going to talk about that tonight.
Yes, sir. Do you want to tell me at all about the social media enterprise you're engaged in with regard to diplomacy, DBN?
Sure. Yeah, the Diplomacy Broadcast Network. I'm very pleased to be hooked up with those guys. They're Zachary Moore and Brandon Fogel and Brian Pravel from the Chicago and Minnesota clubs are really the ones that got DBN going. I'm sort of the hired help that comes in and is on the screen. But I do a news program every month called Deadline News, and we talk about the news from the world of diplomacy, and then we have a panel discussion about a particular diplomacy topic. This is all on YouTube or on diplobn.com is the website you can get to. And in fact, Douglas, you were on our last episode of Deadline News as part of the panel discussion, as you know, and hopefully your viewers have seen you. We had a discussion about opening alliances, which I thought was fun.
I agree. It was a pleasure to participate, and you're a great interviewer. You have a lot of presence and gravitas. So I was very glad to participate in that and to speak to some really great players as well.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that was a great panel that we had.
But I'm glad you guys have gotten that started, because I feel like that adds an extra layer of legitimacy to the hobby that we basically have news coverage now.
It's really true, and in some ways sports coverage when you think about it. Because, for example, the Virtual World Diplomacy Classic this past weekend had 100 players around the world. We had 3 different days of games, and that means 3 different days of coverage. It was just like watching the Masters or something on TV. Or on some other sport on ESPN or something, and it's just incredibly fun that we have, again, another very, very small silver lining to this cloud that we're in, but it's a silver lining nonetheless.
Agreed. I mean, I think it's amazing the level of analysis that you can get on a diplomacy board, and it probably exceeds the kind of detail that one can go into about a sports in a sports analysis, because to a certain extent, when you're observing golf, you can tell if the ball went toward the hole just by looking. But with the diplomacy board, there are layers there that can't be necessarily conveyed to the average viewer just from looking at an image of the board. And that's where a lot of insight from these experienced players, such as yourself, can come in.
Yeah, I think that's true. And in addition, you can tell by looking at the screen whether whether the screen pass worked or not, or whether the trap play worked on the off tackle run. You can see from looking on the screen in a football game. On a diplomacy game, it's a little bit in doubt whether that was the right move, whether Venice really should have gone to Piedmont or not. And so you can have commentators that frankly disagree about, and that's fun too, because there's more than one way to look at things in diplomacy.
Agreed. Now, I'm going to let you get to what you and the audience are excitedly waiting for, which is your tips for success at high-level tournament play.
Well, I have a list here that I'm going to call the top 10 tips to tackle tournaments. And we'll go down from 10 to 1, basically. And to help your viewers remember this at home, each one of my top 10 tips to tackle tournaments starts with the letter T.
I love the alliterations.
This episode of Florida Man is brought to you by the letter T. But let's start with number 10, which is training. And I think it's so important before you go to a tournament to have some do some homework, honestly. It's what I said earlier when I went to my first tournament. That was a little bit, intimidating in some ways, but I had played, scores and scores of games of diplomacy. So I had some level of knowledge as opposed to going to a tournament that was like my 5th time to play or something. That's not what it was. And now nowadays, it's way easier to do that homework than it was at my day when we just had Diplomacy World, which came out 4 times a year, and you could read those articles. And then you had playing with your buddies. That was the way to do training. But now you can go to the NADF, the North American Diplomacy Federation website, which is the nadf.org, and you can find a bunch of online resources that are available to you to learn about the game. In fact, one of the resources that's listed on the media page is your series on YouTube is one of the things that you could watch. But in addition to that, there's DBN coverage, and there's lots and lots of articles online that go way back. And all of that stuff is outlined on the NADF website. And of course, there's other sites as well, but that's just a site that I know about because I just got finished putting it up. And we link to all the other things that you might think about, the Diplomacy World archives and Diplomatic Pouch and the Diplomatic Archive and all the things you can go. So I'm not saying that all of those articles need to be read, but you should go read a few, particularly on subjects you're not sure about. And then even more importantly, play some games. Go on Play Diplomacy, go on WebDip, go on VDip, Conspiracy, whatever app or web platform you can find. Go play some games. And when you do that, try some different things when you play. Don't always open to the channel or not. Don't always, open to Galicia or not. Try some different things out in games that, quote, don't count as much, end quote, before you start going to tournaments. So that's what I mean when I say get some training.
Makes sense. You wouldn't go into a sports tournament without, knowing how to hold the baseball bat or whatever. I think you do have to have some preparation, some experience in order to have some internal resources to draw upon.
Yeah, that's totally right. Now, number 9 is tactics. Which in diplomacy is sort of our putting or our chipping or whatever skill you want to use from golf, and you could throw baseballs, whatever analogy you want to look at. But tactics are frankly practicing how to move your pieces around, practicing the best way to defend, practicing the best way to attack, practicing convoy routes and supports, and making sure you understand how support orders get cut or not cut in situations. And the best way, in my opinion, to practice your tactics is to play a lot of gunboat, because gunboat is not entirely a tactical exercise. There are negotiations that take place by moves, but gunboat, which of course is diplomacy. Sorry, I have the cat trying to invade the discussion here.
No problem.
Gunboat, of course, is mostly about tactics. So if you go play a bunch of it, of course, you can play it online. You could play it on the NADF server. There's lots of places you can go to play gunboat, we literally have a cat that's invading. As you can see, here comes the tail. The other thing I want to point out about Tactic is something called Speedboat, which they also play on the NADF server, Discord server, and lots of other places. Speedboat is basically gunboat with 5-minute turns. So it's almost like an immediate gunboat that you're playing live, but you're still playing it not knowing who the other players are. So it can be fascinating, it can be fun, it can be fast, but playing a bunch of speedboat games can really help your tactics.
Sounds very exciting as well.
Oh yeah, it's fun. It really is. All right, well, let's go from technical stuff more to some psychological stuff. So number 8 tip is temperament. And I don't think I can stress this one enough. You know, face-to-face diplomacy, and for that matter, virtual face-to-face diplomacy, because of the immediacy of the event, is very demanding on you, emotionally, intellectually, and frankly, even physically. Could be very demanding, and you need to be prepared for that temperamentally. And in some ways, you can't really change your attitude or change your personality that much, but you can get some sleep. You can eat on a regular basis. And face-to-face is really it's a slugfest. It's an exhausting thing. And so going into it with the right frame of mind and the right preparation psychologically and physically is important. But also, I would say from a temperament point of view, it's even more important to remember that this is a game about relationships. You know, sometimes we think this is sort of like a war game, and it's not. It's really not like sitting down and playing Third Reich or some, you know, really standard classic war game. Mm-hmm. It's not like playing Stratego. You know, you're sitting down and you're playing a game that's really about people and not about pieces. As important as the pieces are, it's essentially a psychological game, and it's completely, absolutely true in the face-to-face environment. So the way to look at that is, you know, when you feel yourself reacting in a negative fashion to something that happened, remember that if you lose control of yourself, you lose control of your temperament or your temper, you cannot make good moves. You cannot make strategic decisions. You cannot talk to somebody in a persuasive way if you don't have control over your reactions and your emotions. And again, I'm not trying to say you have to become Mr. Spock or something, but you need to be self-aware about the extent to which you cannot or can control your behavior. Answer, you can control it. And the more that you do it, the more you practice, the better at that you will get.
Yeah. And, you know, in some ways, diplomacy seems like good training for politics. Keep control. Well, very important.
Honestly, it's good training for communication and persuasion in lots of environments. As you know, there are lots of lawyers that are into diplomacy. And I think that's partially because, at least in some aspects of the law, there's a lot of the same skills involved. And by that, I mean making relationships and being persuasive. You know, there's nothing improper about saying that if you have a good relationship with your opposing counsel and with the judge, you're going to do better. You're going to be more persuasive than if you come in there like a bull in a china shop all the time. And the same is true on the diplomacy board, in my opinion. Which leads us to number 7, which is talking. You know, in a face-to-face environment, obviously that's what we do. We're not writing, we're not typing, we're talking. And talking is a very different skill, and it's an important skill, and it also, in my opinion, means listening. In fact, during your negotiations in a face-to-face diplomacy tournament or virtual face-to-face, you should be listening as much as, if not more, than you are talking. Because you will learn more information, and you need to learn information by listening, in addition to the fact that you really want other people to talk. You want things to be their idea. Now, you might want to push and prod them in the right direction to make them think it's their idea, but you want it to be because you want some buy-in. So just as a communication skill, the concept of listening and active listening even can be very important in a diplomatic negotiation. And the other thing I want to say about that before we move on to the next one is, in a face-to-face environment, your body actually matters a lot. If it's in my experience, if I want to establish a relationship with somebody, particularly early in the game, you will see me sit down a lot, even while they're standing, as a way to make myself appear less threatening or less demanding or less insistent. And there are some players that do the opposite. You know, they get right in your face and sort of try to overwhelm you, and that can work. But in my opinion, being control over your body language is really important. Put your hands behind your back if you're trying to not come across that way. Or conversely, if you really think you can get some play by intimidation is not the right word, but being extremely forceful, that would be the time to get your hands out from behind your back and to stand up and get closer to somebody. So that it all depends on the situation. But honestly, you probably can't turn yourself into some kind of body language expert. A lot of it is intuitive, but all I'm saying is that, again, be self-aware. If you're one of those people that is loud and brash and overbearing and stuff, make sure you know how to dial that back and when to dial that back, because you're going to need to dial that back some.
That makes a lot of sense to me. Yeah, physicality matters. I have seen people turn on the persuasion and become charming and cool and suave. It can be a very different personality than they had just a minute before. So.
Yeah, and sometimes talking for its own sake is okay, particularly if you've got a couple of minutes. You don't have a lot to say to Turkey. You're France, and you're really just trying to figure out who's going to support who into Burgundy or whatever. If you got a minute or two, talk to Turkey. That may bring some dividends later. And just being friendly, it can really bring you a lot of dividends. In addition to the fact that this is a game about human relationships, and you're going to see a lot of these people later. Face-to-face circuit is big, but it's not that big. And you're going to run into a lot of the same people again. And so just having a good relationship with people is rewarding in and of itself, don't get me wrong, but it also has some benefits later in future games. So I just think that's something to consider. Well, let's move on to number 6, which is really more of a strategic concept than a tactical one or a technical one. And that's the theory is my T word for that one, theory. And I want to quote from General Eisenhower on this one. He said one time that a good battle plan is important, but a battle plan never survived first contact with the enemy. So it is good to have a theory, in my opinion, about how you want to proceed if you're playing Germany or playing Italy or whatever on that particular board. I'd sort of like to open, where Germany goes to Holland instead of Denmark. I wonder if I could make that happen. I mean, it's okay to have that plan going in. In fact, I think having a plan is good. Mm-hmm. I don't like the idea, and there are plenty of good diplomacy players that disagree with me about this, by the way, and they think that you should essentially go in with a blank slate and just react to what other people do. And that is not the school of diplomacy theory that I attended or that I have ever taught at, because I think it's good to have a plan. Now, you do need to react, as I say, that's why I quoted Eisenhower. If you want to do an RT and you're the Russians and you go talk to the Turks and you don't get a good vibe about it, or you don't get them to engage with you like you want, okay, fine, ditch that and talk about DMZing the Galicia and going after Turkey, fine. But I just like having a plan so that I have some concept of what I want to do during that first 15 minutes of negotiation, as opposed to just reacting to what other people say. I'd like to have something affirmative to offer if the opportunity arises. So that's why I say have some kind of plan.
Oh, yeah.
One correlator to that's what you and I talked about in that Deadline News episode the other day, which was favored alliances. I mean, I think it's fine to be a big fan of the EF alliance, what we call the Leviathan on DBM. It's fine. But if you're in a situation where Anglo-German alliance seems to make more sense, you're more simpatico with the German player, or you like what he said versus what the French, you didn't like what the French player, what she said, so you decide you're going to go the other way. Nothing wrong with that. I would argue that it's fine to have favored alliances and favored openings. Just know how to play all of them, so that if the EF doesn't look legit, then you know how to play the C line. You know how to do a Franco-German C line against the English, because you might have to do that in this particular game. Or if you don't like the RT, or the AT, for example, a lot of people don't like the Astro-Turk, which I love. But if you don't like it, it may turn out to be, when you're Austria, that Turkey is the player that you've connected with the most, and it has the most good things to say. Well, know how to play the AT instead of just always wanting to just do the same thing all the time. Be flexible.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. There's no reliable cure-all for any one country, any position, and even if there is sometimes maybe an optimal alliance, if you were to do each thing right, you won't always find an accommodating partner in the other country that you were hoping to work with.
Oh yeah.
So, yeah, you have to remain flexible about that.
Yeah, you may be France and you want to do a sea line opening against the English and kill them. Well, the Italians open to the west or something, and now you're having to reevaluate your plan. You may have to make peace with the English. You may have to even bury the hatchet with the English and help them fight the Germans while you fend off the Italians. or something. I mean, it just, you got to be flexible in this game. But let's talk about number 5, which is a limitation on how flexible one might want to be, which is time. Unlike in an online game, what we call asynchronous games online, face-to-face, virtual face-to-face is happening with a 15-minute clock, and you can hear it in your head, and sometimes you can hear it out loud. In face-to-face events, there's an Australian accent lady, and that's what most people use. I don't actually use that in my tournament. Most people actually use that countdown clock, and you can hear it in the hallway. And so you know that the time is going, and time is very limited. You think 15 minutes is a long time, but it ain't much at all. In a lot of games, you're like, man, where did all the time go? So I think it's important to remember 3 things about that. The first is it can be a strategy to monopolize other people's time, to keep them from going and talking to people you don't want to talk to. But be careful about that, because if you seem to be rude or overbearing about that, it's going to backfire on you. And the second thing I want you to think about is always, and I think this always should be underlined, always write a set of provisional orders immediately after the last turn was adjudicated before you go start talking to people. Because you can get to the very end of the time, and depending on how the tournament is set up, you may end up with a time where you got to have your orders in by the time that 15 minutes is up, or 17 minutes, or whatever have the thing set up. And if you don't have them in, that's an NMR, and that stinks. So if you want to have something written, even if you're going to change it, you want to have something written either right before you go talk to the first person or as you're talking to the first person. Write down some provisional orders so that you have something to turn in if you run out of time. And of course, the third point is always be cognizant of how much time you've got left, and have in your head the people that you have to talk to and how much time you're going to need to go find them. You've got to talk to Italy about Tunis. Got to do it. They've got to bounce the Austrians there, or it's going to be a major problem for the Austrians and the Turks getting out of the box. And so make sure you've got a minute to go make a beeline to the Italians to talk to them about that. And oh, by the way, I've also got to talk to the Russians about making sure they support themselves to Ukraine, or whatever it is. Make sure you're in your head, you know exactly what you've got to get done and how many minutes you need to do it, and make sure you fit those in. And that sounds like a lot that I'm just telling you all to do. That's because it is a lot. That's the primary challenge of face-to-face, is time management. Because later in the game, maybe you don't need as much, particularly early in the game, every minute counts. If it doesn't count, it means you're probably getting creamed somehow. That's not any fun. If you're in the middle of the action and needing all the 15 minutes, you're probably doing well.
Makes sense. I mean, there's 15 minutes, 6 other players. That's less than 3 minutes to talk to each person. It should be a crunch.
It's true. I mean, in an asynchronous game, online game, you should talk to most people most turns, and you have plenty of time to at least send them a quick message. Face-to-face, I'd like to say that you can talk to everybody, but frankly, that doesn't always happen, because you're going to need some extra time with an alliance partner or whatever. Mm-hmm. So there's going to be some people you're not always going to talk to. So time management is a skill that only comes with practice, honestly. And the first time you go to a face-to-face event, it'll freak you out. Because I've been hearing these stories for 30 plus years. It'll freak you out. I understand that. But just get back up, brush yourself off, and get back in there and learn how to do it better. Let's talk about number 4, which is tempo, which sounds a lot like time, but it's not the same thing. Time is more of a technical skill. Tempo is about strategic sense. Is this the time for me to put my foot on the gas or to put my foot on the brake? Is this the time to really take advantage of this situation, or do I need to be patient and not stab the Italians yet or something? Is this the time for me to waive a build because that'll make me feel less threatening to the rest of the board, or is this the time I really got to have all my units? So I need to make sure if I take 3 in 01 that I build all 3 units. There are situations where that makes sense, and there are situations where it makes sense to waive a build. And so this sense of tempo is really important. You'll hear commentators on DBN or elsewhere talk about tempo. And tempo has to do not only with the decisions I was just talking about, but also the strategic tempo and tactical tempo on the board. You have a hold order that should have been a move order. You have lost tempo because you've lost the chance to advance the position or advance your pieces in a way that's keeping up with the advancements going on the other side of the board, or even with another power on the same side of the board.
Interesting. It sounds like this concept is kind of should kind of motivate people to just kind of keep moving, because they need to make as much progress as they can, as quickly as they can. At least that last interpretation of it.
Well, and I don't want to make it sound like that holds are never never appropriate. But honestly, they're rarely appropriate. They're rarely appropriate. And you will see me have hold orders, and sometimes you do a hold order for diplomatic reasons. But I'm talking about for sheer tactics, a hold is almost never the right answer. It can be, but almost never. I mean, if you're going to hold, if you're going to try to stay put, at least attack something you know is not moving. some kind of enemy that you know is not moving. In certain systems like Backstabber, well, actually, Backstabber, you can actually put in an order that's not valid, and sometimes that can be a good diplomatic thing to do. You know, Army Venice supports Fleet Edinburgh to the Norwegian, and the reason that you put that into Backstabber is because you didn't really have time to talk to the English. But man, go attack the Russians. Stop what you're doing and go attack the Russians. Look how big they're getting. So you can sometimes use your orders instead of a hold, depending on what program you're in. You can use the orders to do that. But in a face-to-face setting, you know, holding can be okay, but look for any alternative that you can to actually hold it, in my opinion.
Interesting. Good.
All right, let's talk about number 3 for a minute, which is transitions. And the main thing I'm talking about here is transition from one part of the game to the next, and also from one play style to the next. In diplomacy, particularly if you've got an unlimited time game, whether that's in a tournament or a house game that's going to be unlimited time, or even in an online environment this applies. If it's going to be an unlimited, there really is an opening phase, a mid game, and an end game, just like there is in chess. I just got finished doing an episode of Legendary Tactics about this, which is going to come out, I think, this week. The mid game is when it's time to make the transition from that opening alliance and maybe killing that opening target to deciding what you're going to do next. And making that transition making it correctly is really important. Do I stab my ally, or do I continue with this ally on to past the stalemate line to the other side of the board? And there's not one answer to that question. It's totally situational, but paying attention to the fact that you've got to make that decision is what I'm talking about. And it can be fascinating to see players make different choices in that environment. There was a game just over the weekend, in the virtual WDC, where somebody had a very clear choice between stabbing their ally or staying with the ally, and this was a Western alliance, and trying to breach the East, and he decided to stab his ally, which I think was the right answer. But sometimes the right answer is to go cross the stalemate line and stab them later in the game for the win or something. So, but the other thing I want to say about transitions is, if you are a player that is sometimes described as an alliance player, somebody that, you know, tends to get an alliance and stick with it and cooperate with it, there's nothing wrong with that. But you shouldn't do that all the time, because you don't want to be predictable. So you need to make the transition from one type of play style to another, depending on the situation. If you're one of those what I call stabomatics, that's always out there taking this and taking that and taking this and taking that and just sort of annoying everybody in sight and playing more of a balance of power game, that's fine, but don't always do that, because sometimes you're not going to make enough progress there, and there's an alliance on the other side of the board that's making progress, and you're sitting around at 6 centers or 7 centers or something, and you don't have an alliance partner. Sometimes you have to react and get an alliance partner in that situation. So again, be flexible.
Interesting.
All right, we got 2 left, and guess what? They're the most important ones. Which is why I left them for last. So number 2 in the countdown is the word try. Do you know how often you will win a game if you don't try? 0 times. That's how many times you will win. And it really does separate the wolves from the lambs, or whatever analogy you want to use. It really does separate players into 2 categories. Those that I call the hold and support guys, that are perfectly content just to sort of hang around and be alive and whatever, and those that are willing to take risks. Those are the 2 general types of players. And I'm not talking about whether you're a reactive player or not. You could be reactive but still be willing in the right situation to go on the attack, to go on the stab, to go to go for the jugular, so to speak. And it's not always the right answer, don't get me wrong. But if you're going to dominate a diplomacy board, you're going to have to at some point try to do so. And you see all kinds, and not just new players, you sometimes see experienced players that get into the habit of just sort of getting up to 6 or 7 centers and then being passive. And again, sometimes that's the right answer, but man, try something else. Try to go out on a limb, take some risks, because no risk, no reward is really true. The number one reason folk don't win games or top the board or whatever the terminology you want to use is because they don't try to. Which leads me to the number one tip that I would say you should take to tournaments, which is trust. Now that sounds weird for it to go to diplomacy, doesn't it? But I think if you don't trust yourself, and also you should say you should trust other players because you can't win without trusting other players too. But on this one, I'm really talking about trusting in yourself. You know, you've got to build self-confidence in order to win a diplomacy game or to do well at a diplomacy tournament. You're not going to find very many people who don't believe in themselves that are able to do that. So this is a sort of a general life tip. It works in life just like it does in diplomacy, in my opinion, is that you need to realize that you do have a say in what happens to you. You don't have control over what happens to you, but you do have a say in it. And so if you don't believe in yourself and decide that you've got a strategy and you're going to stick to it, and by God, you can win this. Not just somebody whose name you've seen on DBN or somebody who's seen a list of people who've won DipCon before, or World DipCon or whatever. All of those people started out as somebody like you. Not you, Douglas, but I'm talking to your viewers. Somebody like you who hasn't won a bunch of tournaments. Everybody started out that way. There's no reason why you can't be that person. If not you, then why not? And if not now, then when? So when you have a situation to boldly go where some of us have gone before, take advantage of it and just do it. And those are my top 10 tips to take to tournaments.
Well, thank you, David. Those were interesting and I dare say inspirational. And I hope that the viewers will agree.
I hope so too. I hope we have some of your viewers that to say, well, you know, that does sound like fun. I'm going to try face-to-face. Yes. When the stupid virus is over with, we have a whole series of tournaments in North America and around the world that you can go to. And we've got these new virtual tournaments that you can participate in. If you can't travel, I understand not everybody can travel to tournaments. I totally get that. But now that we've got these virtual face-to-face things, you can have a lot of what I just said, the fun I think I've just communicated. You can have those in a virtual setting from the comfort of your own living room. So take advantage of that. There's one coming up in January, January the 30th, will be the virtual version of the British Columbian tournament Cascadia. And so if you're inspired at all to try sort of this, timed, 15-minute turn type stuff, which is how diplomacy was intended to be played originally, then try that tournament and try all the other ones that are coming up as the year progresses.
Sounds like a worthy challenge for all of our audience members. Hopefully we see a lot of participation.
I hope so too.